Hello, John.
Yes, George. Hello.
Hi. How was your Christmas? Or should I say the Witch's Sabbath?
It was great. There were no tremendous casualties. The kids both got a roughly equal number of presents, so there wasn't any disruptive envy on one side or another. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, you got to worry about that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure. And it was, did you have snow?
We still have some snow on the ground. It actually has been drizzling a lot lately. So not so good for hockey.
Yeah, I guess not. Well, you should come out here and play hockey. It's 16 degrees right now, and we have snow on the ground and ice hanging down from the gutters.
Ooh, that sounds pretty.
Yeah, in fact, I can probably show you a peek out the window here. Let's see.
You're so much more adventurous with your with your audio-visual stuff. I'm always too nervous to touch anything when I'm doing one of these.
Yeah, well, I figured the stakes are so low that...
That's the attitude, George. What the hell? Who cares? No one's watching anyway. That's what Bob Wright wants to hear us say, right?
No, I shouldn't have said that. You're right.
It's too late now. It's already gone into the blogosphere. You're nasty little
Bob.
meme.
Yeah.
So what are we...
I don't think it's one that has legs, but... yeah, anyway, what should we talk about?
I thought we could start with I just got my issue of Science, which is the premier peer-reviewed scientific journal in the United States and arguably the world, along with Nature. So I'm just holding it up in front of the screen. This is the year-end issue in which they feature what they believe is the science breakthrough of the year.
Oh, yeah, and I saw the cover has a picture of a guy with his genome on a T-shirt.
Yeah, it's a great...
that was good.
It's a great image, and it's pretty hard to argue with their pick. Human genetic variation, although, that I would think could be the top story over the last decade. I mean, it's sort of like climate change. It's one of these huge and sort of glacially progressing science stories.
Yeah, and I guess there was just a number of kind of a threshold that they crossed of micro breakthroughs in the last year that pushed them to decide on that as the number one story.
Yeah, so there were discoveries of some specific genes that show a lot of variation between different populations, genes related to language, for example, to certain diseases, and also what this article mentions and really even focuses on is the proliferation of commercial genome scans.
Yeah.
So now you or I, well, we can't because we don't have enough money, but wealthy people can pay a few $100,000 to have their entire genomes scanned. And this has become something, I mean, at this point it's more just as a kind of a fad than something that has serious medical consequences.
Yeah, so you keep it on a keychain drive.
Yeah.
And show people, hey, this is my genome, in case anything happens to me, just, plug this into the computer and replicate me.
So, George, if this was cheap enough, would you get your genome scanned and find out what your risks are for various diseases and disorders?
Well, I don't think I would, but I don't really have any, there's no family history of any real nasty genetically rooted diseases that I know about. So I don't think I would be tempted to do that, because now whole body, CT scans are affordable, but I haven't chosen to do that.
So,
I guess pretty soon what will happen is, they have these semi-trailer trucks that'll pull into town and park in the supermarket parking lot, and you can go in and get a full body scan for $100 or something. It's probably cost more than that, but that already exists, and I'm sure they'll, the next thing in a few years will be the truck pulls into town and you come and get your genome scanned. But I still don't think there's a whole lot you can do with the information.
My guess is that the costs of these tests are going to drop dramatically over the next few years, and then we'll start seeing some really serious medical and even economic and social consequences from these sorts of tests. So they sort of touch on this in a couple of articles in this issue of Science. And they talk about how there's the potential of this kind of I guess one of the things that's happened over the last year or year or two has been that they found that there's more genetic variation among people than they had guessed. So I think the old statistic had been that we all share 99.5% of each other's genes, so there's only 0.5% variation between us, and I think. Yeah,
and we share 99.0% with chimpanzees.
Well,
right?
I think those two figures have changed somewhat. So I think now, I just read this on Edge over the last couple of days. I think now the figure for chimpanzees has dropped down to 98.5, and among humans it's 99. So rather than 99.5. So the variation between us and chimpanzees is a little bit larger, and the variation within Homo sapiens is also larger. So
between any two of us, it's the 1% that makes the difference.
That's right.
Of course, that's kind of oversimplified, right? Because another big lesson that's been coming out in the last few years is just how complex the genome is, and it's not this, like static map or blueprint so much as, it's like a computer operating system where one gene turns on another gene that turns on another gene, and you get these sort of genetic symphonies going.
Right. Well, I guess the concern. I mean, there are lots of dangers that this type of research poses, and one is that it could feed into the our tendency to distinguish ourselves from other people in negative ways. So racism, sexism, and all these sorts of social problems could be exacerbated by this type of research. Also, you have the problem with medical tests or genes that confer just a probability of acquiring a certain type of disease. So what do you do with the knowledge that you have a gene that increases your risk of schizophrenia, let's say, by 50%? So that means...
just knowing that could probably make you schizophrenic.
That's right. So this is...
But it depends. But on the other hand, if you had a gene that if you had a family history, say, of breast cancer or prostate cancer or any kind of cancer, and so you had the family history, so you're already worried, and then you could get the test and then see if you had the same genetic variants or defects that had been linked to the disease, then you could be a lot more. You could be very careful about getting the tests every year. And then if you found out that you didn't have that, it would be a huge relief.
Yeah, it's just troubling when you've got tests for, first of all, tests that are probabilistic rather than telling you will definitely have these.
Yeah, but that's true of any test.
Well, some are more. I mean, you've got some tests, for example, for single mutation diseases like Huntington's disease that I think are pretty much 100%. If you have this particular mutation that you've inherited from both of your parents, you will get that disease. It's only a question of when. It might be you're at age 35 or age 50. The problem is there's nothing you can do about it. There are no. So we've got the genetic information that allows us to predict disease, diagnose disease, but not treat or cure disease, at least not in any truly effective way.
Yeah. So Huntington's chorea, that's what Woody Guthrie had, right? And then Arlo Guthrie he had the genetic susceptibility to it. So would you want to know that?
Well, but so I don't know if he had himself tested, but he's old enough now that he doesn't. He's not a carrier. But there's an interesting story about Huntington's disease. That the woman, I think her name is Nancy Wexler at Columbia University, who discovered the mutation that causes Huntington's disease. She was motivated to do that because it's in her family, and I think either at least one of her parents died of the disease, and so she developed this test for it. This is back in the late 80s, early 90s, but she has never said whether she herself has been tested. Although I think she's old enough now. I think she's in her early 50s. I think she's old enough now that she almost certainly does not have the disease. There is a case of a person who developed this test, was motivated to do all this research, but didn't even see enough value in using the test that she herself would be tested.
Yeah, but maybe if she'd known there was a treatment or a way to head it off if you find that you are going to get it, that probably would have been a different thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But again, there are.
So it seems like it depends on the disease, but I see what you mean. If people are just going to go out and wholesale, get their genome scanned and then get a printout saying here are all the things you might be susceptible to, that wouldn't be very good for the nation's mental health, probably.
Well, and then there's also the possibility that the insurance companies can get their hands on this kind of information and deny people coverage. I think there is already legislation to prevent that from happening. For example, if a woman carries a gene that puts her at risk of early onset breast cancer, I think she can be tested. She can get the test, but insurance companies can't use that information if they somehow acquire it to increase her premiums or deny her coverage.
Yeah. Well, they'd have to do something like that.
But it's still really, it's very problematic stuff. The backdrop of, there are a couple of different long-term scenarios that come to mind. Lee Silver, who's actually been on Blogging Heads with Carl Zimmer, wrote a book.
Yeah, boy, that was a good show.
Yeah, it was a good show. Carl is really bringing in some great people. They talked a little bit about a book of Lee's called Remaking Eden that came out about, I think, 8 years ago, in which he talked about the long-term consequences of genetic engineering. And he thought that it would be, the old fear was that you'd have genetic engineering imposed from the top in sort of Nazi style. But Silver said what's much more likely, especially in a country like the United States, is that you get market-driven commercial genetic engineering in which wealthy people will pay to tinker with their own genes to give them better mental or physical attributes or to improve the attributes of their children. And he worried that eventually you might even create a new species called the genetically enriched, or gen-rich, as he put it.
Yeah, so it's like something out of Brave New World.
Brave New World, or the...
Yeah, didn't they have that exact thing?
Yeah, pretty much. And then you had sort of classes of people with different genetic attributes who were assigned to different levels of the social hierarchy. There was another movie, there was a movie that came out maybe 10 years ago called Gattaca that also explored this same idea that you had two different species, one genetically enhanced and the other not.
Well, yeah. So I think that I can see why they made that the story of the year, or the breakthrough of the year, or whatever they call it.
Yeah. I guess again, one of my caveats. I always like to point out the failures of some of these exciting fields of research. So we've talked about this in the past, but I'll just remind people that so far, the field of gene therapy, which attempts to correct some genetic mutations that cause disease, has been a complete failure thus far. And it's been going on for almost 20 years now, and really there have been no unqualified successes coming out of gene therapy. Also, there has been a string of claims about the discovery of genes for some complex traits and disorders like homosexuality, high intelligence, manic depression, schizophrenia, and none of these claims have been corroborated. So, that's another thing that worries me about this field. There's just this tremendous potential for hype and overinterpretation and so forth.
Well, yeah, because again, the lesson being just how complex the genome is. That's what amazes me.
Yes.
We were kind of, taught in school to think of it as like, the blueprint was the metaphor that they always used, and I just love this idea of thinking of it as more like the operating system.
Right.
And just like, you could take the entire code of the operating system on my computer here and, read it out, the genome of my computer, long, huge row of ones and zeros, and, that makes everything that happens in my computer is basically determined somehow. Well, not everything, because there's the environmental influence of me interacting with the computer. But to say that you could go from the genome to predict exactly what the person's going to be like and what's going to be right or wrong about them would be like saying that you could go from the bit code of the operating system of my computer and predict what the desktop looks like at this moment.
There's a high...
Because there's just so many factors, both internally, internally the... what's the word? These nonlinear responses where the genes turning on genes that turn on genes, and then, on the other hand, all of the environmental influences of what I'm typing into the keyboard and what's affecting me to make me type this. And just, this complexity is just overwhelming, and it's kind of beautiful. And
it's something that scientists and the rest of us need to keep in mind when we consider the potential of this research. By the way, I should...
Yeah, it's easy. It's easier to think you understand it when you don't at all, or not yet, anyway.
I should, not to digress, but on Christmas Eve, my family and I went to see a movie called I Am Legend, which is a new end-of-the-world movie with Will Smith as the last... possibly the last surviving person on Earth, and the premise is that this scientist, played by Emma Thompson, it's great casting because Emma Thompson, she can't do anything bad, but she comes up.
Emma Thompson's an evil scientist. Is that what you know?
She turns out to be an evil scientist. She has come up with a cure for cancer, a virus that alters the genome in such a way that that cells cannot become cancerous. So cancer is finally cured, and they have her on television talking about these miraculous clinical trials, and we finally put this scourge of humanity behind us. And then it turns out that that people that the virus mutates, and it becomes a disease that turns people into flesh-eating zombies. And so it kills almost everybody on Earth outright, but those who are left are turned into, there may be 500,000 people left alive, and they are all flesh-eating zombies, and they're all trying to destroy or to kill and eat Will Smith, who for some reason has immunity to this disease. And so it was, in a way, it was sort of, scientists would probably look at this and go, "Oh my God, the public is so naive, and look at this ridiculous, scary scenario they're conjuring up out of this wonderful genetic research." But I think it's good that pop culture warns us about the unintended consequences of science in even these exaggerated, cartoonish ways.
Yeah, there does, though, seem to be a tendency, just in the history of cinema, to cast scientists as evil characters.
Well, what's interesting, at the end of this movie, though...
I was thinking of E.T.
E.T. Oh, yeah.
At the end of where the extraterrestrial, is being hidden out in the suburban house in California, and then they discover him, and then all these, the evil science takes over, and they set up big tents and come in and, scary robot-like suits, and, to protect themselves against space germs and things, and get the poor, cute little alien and put him in captivity.
But remember, there's one scientist who turns out to be a good guy, played by Peter Coyote. I can't believe I remember these things. So, they look scary at first, but then once you got to know them, they weren't so bad. And I Am Legend, at the end, it wasn't all anti-science, which was sort of interesting. Will Smith has created this little laboratory, and he's trying to find a cure for the disease, in part by studying himself. And at the end, he finally, not to ruin the movie, but I'm going to ruin the movie, he discovers the cure. So science is the problem, but it's also the solution.
But there's really rarely a movie where a scientist is a hero.
Yeah, well...
It's almost always, at least the ones that get any currency, it's science run amok, like Jurassic Park or the Andromeda Strain.
Yeah, right.
You don't have something like, there was a novel by Sinclair Lewis called Aerosmith.
Oh, right. Sure.
Yeah, I wonder if there's ever a movie of that. Well, of course there was a good movie of Madame Curie. Yeah, where she was the hero discovering radium, and
I think
then poor Pierre getting run down by the carriage while he was crossing the street after buying Marie a present.
Yeah, I think it's appropriate for scientists to be demonized as well as lionized.
Yeah, except I think they're demonized more in the movies, but I agree they shouldn't be. It shouldn't always be the scientific hero, but I don't think that's going to happen.
No.
I mean, we have such an anti-science environment right now. And speaking of which, did you see that John Brockman's Edge? He had a really nice essay about best science books of the year, or just prominent science books of the year. And he was pointing out that neither the New York Times Book Review's top 100 books of the year included a single science book.
Yeah, I saw that.
And that The Economist didn't have, I guess The Economist does the best books of the year in different categories, and they didn't have a science category.
Yeah, well,
And then he listed all these books that he knew about, many of them from Edge contributors and many of them not, and there were clearly books on there that were better, in my opinion, than some of the things that were on either of these lists, and it's just like they seem to have forgotten about science.
Yeah, I know. This is. We sort of talked about this before. I don't like this special pleading for science, and it makes me uncomfortable when science junkies like us tell other people that they should pay more attention to science. But
I don't think you should pay more attention to it. I don't think it should be a didactic thing, but it's just a lament that people aren't interested enough to do it on their own. But people are interested enough to write and read these books. So I think what John Brockman was complaining about was that this wasn't really being reflected in the at least in the book review media.
Well, I was surprised that, for example, and I hope this segue isn't happening too early, that Steve Pinker's book, The Stuff of Thought, which we talked about a little bit last week, wasn't on the Times notable book.
Yeah. Because in addition to being a good science book, he's like a prominent public intellectual.
Yeah, and this really, I thought it was really a major work for him, and it's a great read. It's everything that you'd want in a science book. It's written at a level that can appeal to any educated person, but it's also got plenty of detail for scientists in the fields that Pinker is writing about. It's been taken very seriously as a work of science. It's been reviewed in Science and in other peer-reviewed journals. So that
I know there was so many other good things too. That just got skipped over. Like Natalie Angier had a book last year, The Canon.
I was surprised that didn't. So I sort of agree that some of these books were unjustly overlooked. It's just that, Yeah,
I'm just kind of scanning down the list, or this book by Margaret Fox on the community that it's called Talking Hands, about this community that uses sign language. That got really good reviews. Howard Gardner had a book. Douglas Hofstadter's I'm a Strange Loop. Christine Keneally, The First Word. Oh, and Sandra Blakesley and Matt Blakesley's book, The Body Has a Mind of Its Own. There's just, just all this stuff that got skipped.
Well, maybe they'll feel so bad that they'll put lots of, the Times will feel so bad they'll put lots of science books, including yours, George, on
maybe, I don't know.
On the list next year.
Well, who knows, but, just in general, the places where you can get any book reviewed is shrinking, but especially for science books. Like, Scientific American eliminated their monthly long review.
Is that right?
And now they're just doing briefs.
Oh, no, I'm going to have to go over there and slap them around.
Yeah, you're on a magazine. Yeah. See if you can put in a word about that.
That's terrible, because the long...
I really enjoyed writing those, too. That was a nice outlet.
The long book review is just such a great occasion to write an essay, a reflective essay on some scientific topic.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Kinsley once said that the whole point of having these people write books is so that there can be book reviews, and then all the intellectual discourse takes place within the book reviews. You don't have to read the books.
Well, as long as they buy them, I don't care if they don't read them.
Oh, yes, you do.
Well.
But, but I guess, the optimistic view is that blogs, the blogosphere is taken over as a way to get word of your book out, and that's just not the same thing.
Well, the whole thing with the blogosphere, God, this is a big topic in itself. I just, I feel as though everybody is talking and nobody is listening. I mean, if everybody in the world has a blog, then who has time to read and reflect on what other people are saying?
Yeah, that puts it well. I hadn't realized quite what was bothering you, but you put your finger on it.
It worries me.
The big echo chamber effect, and also it's this hit or miss thing, where you just kind of, you link to something and then write a smart aleck comment, and this is, sort of, taken for criticism.
Right.
Or you write a positive comment, but it'll be interesting to see if this just continues to mushroom, or if it just eventually kind of settles down to where most people get tired of doing it, and there's just too much, and it kind of we look back on it as this fad. And
geez, I've already gone through.
I suspect that won't happen.
I've already gone through that cycle just myself a half dozen times over the last 10 years.
Wait, cycle of what?
Cycle of getting really interested in checking out things in the blogosphere and wanting to comment on them myself, and then just thinking, oh my God, it's too much. Life is too short. I can't be bothered with all this crap out there, and pulling back, and then also thinking that I'm blabbing too much, as I am right now. And
well, yeah, as we're here on Blogging Heads complaining about blogs and superficial off the cuff analysis.
Blabbing heads.
Yeah, but I like, I've been doing this thing mostly on Santa Fe politics and environmental stuff, and I consider it an anti-blog.
Uh-huh.
Because on one hand, I don't use blog software. I hand code all my HTML and lay out my pages. Plus, it's upside down for a blog. It actually has a beginning, and then when I get to the end of the page, after about a month of commentary, I go on to the next page and start at the top and go to the bottom. So for a while I was experimenting with WordPress, one of these blogging software, and I was thinking of moving over to that. And then I just thought, all these things look the same, just with, there's just this blog look that I wanted to avoid. But,
an anti-blog, huh, George? That reminds me.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping the idea of anti-blog catches on, and people writing long. Like I kind of consider Cocktail Party Physics, Jennifer Lett's online journal. I won't call it a blog. That to me seems like the anti-blog too.
Because she writes.
I mean, she writes these long, maybe 1,500 word. I don't know how long, but very long posts, and they're really little essays where she, comes up with the subject and explores it, and it's not just linking to something and saying LOL or rolling on the floor laughing.
Right. Yeah, I'm amazed at the effort that she puts into some of her blog posts, like the ones that she linked to when you and she spoke last summer. The idea of an anti-blog reminds me of the concept of an anti-guru. So,
what's that?
The whole. So my last book, I got into the whole guru phenomenon and the Enlightenment industries.
Right.
People are peddling spiritual ecstasy, and there's a whole class of gurus who sell themselves as anti-gurus. They tell you that you don't need a guru, there is no path to truth, and you don't need this particular. And so they sell themselves as anti-gurus, and of course it's just another type of guru. That's just a marketing shtick to sell yourself.
Maybe that's what the anti-blog is.
So an anti-blog is really just another kind of blog.
Yeah.
But
except that it's upside down and long, and
well, that's good.
And you're not allowed to use WordPress.
Well, the thing is, there's nothing good per se about long blog posts, but when it's somebody like you or Jennifer who has interesting things to say and has a rich background in a particular topic, then it is worthwhile. But
I mean, it's more. And Sean Carroll, now Jennifer's husband.
Oh, right.
He has a really good what I consider anti-blog. He's one of several people that participates in Cosmic Variance. And, but I mean, I don't know. I guess when I started doing this, which was before the word blog had been coined, to me it was just journalism and writing, and it just happened to be online instead of on paper. But of course, the medium, transforms the message.
Yeah. Well, man, this is a real hall of mirrors. Blogging about blogging.
Yeah, and this whole thing about it all this video too.
Uh-oh, George, sounds like you're having a crisis of faith here, right on camera.
Yeah, it'll pass. It's because this is so fun.
Well, so what else? Do you want to talk first
there was something
about?
Else.
We've got two big.
Oh, Pinker.
We can go Pinker, and then
we were going to get back to Pinker, and we had we already passed by our segue into Pinker.
Okay, so.
And you're going to tell us about his segment on dirty words. I started watching, by the way, the video of Pinker on the CSW website. Yeah. That was really good.
I'm glad you liked it. The last time I checked, we only had one comment, and it was from this guy named Uncle Al. I shouldn't even mention his name because I don't want to encourage him, but it's too late anyway. He's this incredibly cranky, misogynistic, racist guy who comments on our blog all the time, and anyway, he's every now and then he's funny, and and so actually, his response to Pinker and me was the only way that this video will become at all popular is if you and Pinker had been wearing thongs and had been naked, or he said as
that could have the opposite.
Yes, well, of course, there's that. But basically, he's saying that videos people want to see are pornographic and or a spectacle of some type, and so having a couple of eggheads talking about language and human nature and so forth, that's not exactly going to go viral.
Well, he's probably not a blogging head watcher then.
No, probably not.
There was another video that I saw. Sorry to digress, but it was on Three Quarks Daily, and I don't know what the source was, but it was all four of the ruling atheists sitting around a table talking. I think it was at Dennett's place in Maine. It looked like, but I'm not sure about that. So it was Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris.
Oh my God!
And they're all sitting around the table talking for an hour or so.
And were they all sort of congratulating each other on their?
Well, just complaining about how they were misunderstood and. I had never seen Hitchens, so it was kind of interesting.
Oh God, I've seen him on shows like Hardball. Some of the talking the cable talking.
Yeah, I used to watch.
And he always is yelling at people not to interrupt him. He always looks like he's and I guess he is drunk. In fact, he says he's
right. He takes great pride in that.
And he's just he's obviously a very clever person, but my God, he's such a bully and a blowhard. But anyway,
anyway, to get not to
dirty words.
I
love this chapter in Pinker, and I thought this was one place where evolutionary psychology had some interesting things to say about our peculiarities of language use. So so the title of the chapter, 7 Words You Can't Say on Television, refers to this famous George Carlin monologue where he's saying, what's the problem with saying words like fuck or cock or cunt, and especially these words with sexual connotations. These are perfectly natural, healthy, and pleasurable human functions, and yet we have this kind of horror of the words that describe these activities and the body parts that are needed to engage in them.
Well, yeah, just as you said, each one of those words, I found myself recoiling.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, really. I mean, I don't like to hear that stuff, but Pinker had some pretty good speculations as to why.
Yeah. So have you had a chance to look at that chapter?
Yeah, I read the chapter, and again, it was the sociobiological explanations. Well, can you summarize?
Well, I'll just tell you what I thought was. I guess I've always thought of myself as, sort of anti-Puritanism when it came to these sorts of words, and so I curse fairly freely, too freely, probably, and
Well, I certainly do if I hit my finger with a hammer or something.
Well, even some of these shows that we've had, and I occasionally curse in class, but I thought it was interesting that, and I guess my attitude toward the words you can't say on television is that it's silly that we do have these taboos, but Pinker pointed out that healthy, pleasurable sex between two consenting adults is only a tiny fraction of the vast range of sexual interactions that humans have. Sex is still a very dangerous activity that can lead to disease. You have rape. You have unwanted pregnancies. So sex is actually fraught with peril. And Pinker says that if you look at it in this way, it actually makes sense that we have the taboos surrounding certain words to describe sexual activities.
Yeah, and as well as for bodily fluids and.
Yeah, and the the explanation for our taboo surrounding words like shit or piss or cum is that these are disease. Now, what's interesting is that it's okay to use these words when you are talking about them as objects of scientific study. So at Stevens, you probably didn't get far enough into the video of Pinker's talk at Stevens, but I finally brought up dirty words, and Pinker started by talking about interesting cultural differences, for example, in the use of the word, brace yourself, cunt. So he grew up in Montreal, and in French, the word cunt really has no charge. It's sort of like crap or ass, and that's true in not only in French Canada, but also in France itself. Whereas in English, it's one of the most shocking taboo words that there is.
Well, as a reverse example of this, bloody, where, if you say bloody in America, it's not a big thing, but in England, it at least used to be pretty severe cuss word.
Well, but it was just interesting that, if you swear in academia these days, you use especially words with sexual connotations, gender implications, and so forth, you can lose your job. But here's Pinker.
I just remembered back in the 70s when I was in college at the University of New Mexico, and this was early 70s, so it was, it was still the 60s. And had an English teacher there who had read a poem by a poet that I think has kind of lapsed into obscurity after her moment of fame, named Lenore Candell. Don't know if she was related to Eric Kandel or not, but anyway, and it was a poem that had it had sex and dirty words in it, and one of the students in the professor's class, the professor was probably some unreconstructed hippie, and one of the kids in his class was from southern or eastern New Mexico, which is pretty conservative. It's more like Texas. And he complained to his father, and this got back to the state legislature or something, and it turned out into this huge brouhaha in the New Mexico state legislative session, and they were going to cut off all of the funding to the University of New Mexico because of this one incident.
Wow.
Because of one bad word that was in this poem that was read in an English class.
Well,
so, yeah, it's...
It occurred to me as Pinker was speaking, because he went on to use cunt, shit, fuck. He said all these words.
Okay.
He said all these words in front of a packed house at Stevens, and I, I was thinking that it's interesting that he can say these because the context reduces them to scientific objects. And so they lose their charge. That's what I was thinking. Of course, it was.
Yeah, so you're not going to get fired over this.
It's still possible that there could have been. I mean, I haven't heard a thing since the talk, but it's possible that people in the audience could have taken offense.
Well, yeah, and I imagine some of them did.
Yeah. Well, we haven't heard.
Well, I guess what I don't understand about Pinker's explanation of why we find these so offensive and revolting, or at least some of us do. I mean, there are sociobiological reasons, like bodily fluids being connected with disease, and reasons why there would be a survival advantage to having this to being revolted by the thing, and then maybe this carries over to being revolted by the word for the thing.
Yeah, Pinker uses this phrase, word magic, which is sort of self-explanatory, but I guess it's even a technical word in, I don't know, anthropology and social science, and the idea of it is that the word somehow embodies what it refers to. So and so.
Well, yeah, back with sympathetic magic,
Yeah.
and I mean, in like Foucault was written about this idea that originally there wasn't really this distinction between the word and what the word signified.
Yeah.
Or at least not the sharp distinction that we think we have now, but maybe really don't.
Well, I think that the way we respond to words reflects a kind of very deep superstitious attitude that even when you look at it rationally, it can still affect you. So, you've got euphemisms surrounding words like, for example, cancer. Pinker mentions this.
That's something that's changed.
Well, there's still people who use the big, they say the big C to describe cancer.
No, that's true. And but it used to be you just wouldn't say the word.
Yeah, it's as though the word.
And occasionally, I still find that, but not nearly so much.
It's as though the word itself can somehow infect you. So I think that phenomenon explains a lot of these taboos.
Well, yeah, and doesn't it relate to that guys at Jonathan Haidt, and Bob and I were talking about this once, and I think you and I brought this up before too. This idea of why we find certain things disgusting in the evolutionary, the ev-psych explanations for why. And this just applies to the words as well as to what the words represent.
Sure, not just disgusting, but terrifying. So it would explain why we have phobias toward snakes and spiders and things like that.
But then the word spider or snake doesn't.
No.
So it's interesting that it's sometimes the word gets mashed together with. With the thing.
Well, in some of these cases, it really, the best you can do is just describe taboos to tradition. That, this is how it's been.
I guess that's what confuses me, because on one hand, you can see the evolutionary psychological basis for the taboos, and on the other hand, like the example you gave with French, at least Canadian French, or with bloody, the word bloody in England, that it's also cultural.
Right.
Yeah, so it's...
Yeah.
It seems that over time, just like with the word cancer, the word becomes more and more detached from the thing, and the word magic kind of dissipates. Right. So I suppose that you could say that that's what's happening with a lot of the of George Carlin's 7 words you can't say on TV, and now you can say them on TV unless it's broadcast TV that's regulated by the FCC, and you can certainly say them on a webcast, and apparently you can say them at a prominent technological institute like Stevens.
I just have to mention a couple more fun facts for Stevens.
Right before Christmas, too.
Yeah, sorry about that,
so
George.
The word magic is disappearing.
It's funny that I didn't realize that some of these words distress you. I'll try to curb my tongue in the future.
Oh, I was kind of kidding, but
I'm
sort of conservative about some things like that. I think there's... I like the idea of polite and civil public discourse, and I really... I think I said this jokingly when we last talked, but I really hope the New York Times maintains its editorial policy of not using these words unless they absolutely have to for some newsworthy reason.
As opposed to the New Yorker, which now uses cuss words freely.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of too bad. To me, it's just kind of like catering to the lowest common denominator instead of trying to raise.
You're such a civilized person, George.
No, I don't know if it's civilized.
Yeah, it's civilized. Let me just mention a couple of fun facts from Stevens that I think people would enjoy. You've heard this idea of there's this legend that the Eskimos have 30 words for snow and we only have a few, and that's apocryphal actually. But
that's not really true, right?
And actually, we have a lot of words for snow and as well. But Pinker says, that's nothing. 30 words for smell. How about, there's some linguists who've counted words for various sex organs and acts. 800 words have been counted for copulation. 1,000 words for male genitalia.
All in the same language?
All in English. Now, this is over time. So, going back to the Elizabethan era and so forth. 1,200 words for female genitalia and 2,000 words for a wanton woman. Which really sort of...
How about for a wanton man?
Well,
probably fewer.
Because it's not... That
not remarkable.
It's not remarkable. It's so these the number of words reflects sort of the if you had one of those maps of the human brain and that go back to phrenology when you have one chunk of the brain devoted to a certain topic, you've got big chunks of the male brain devoted to female genitalia and the sex act and so forth, and that's why we generate so many words for these things.
That's interesting.
Let's see. Another interesting fact is that people who have brain damage that leads to aphasia, where they have profound language disorders, in some cases can't speak at all, very often still retain the ability to curse, or not the ability. They still curse.
Well, yeah, and then there's Tourette's syndrome, which is
So
where the curse words it's almost like neurological tics.
Yeah, and the suggestion is that swearing has its own little brain module that's separate from the brain substrate for other language functions.
Huh. Well, is there any suggestion, like in Pinker's work, that swear words are in the the things that people blurt out, like when they hit their hammer, or if they have Tourette's syndrome, that this is like the hard kernel of language, what first developed?
I guess there have been some theories along those lines that some of the original words were the kinds of things that we blurt out when we're startled or when we feel sudden pain. So whoops, ouch, damn, those sorts of things that really don't have any sort of external referent. They're just expressing shock, pain, dismay, and that sort of thing. I definitely
come forth with those occasionally. Like, I accidentally touched the 10,000 volt electrode on my Rumkorf coil.
And what did you say?
Damn!
I thought it would be like, oh, fudge!
It was actually worse than that. I said expletive. Or as the New York Times would put it, I said an expletive. Never mind.
Hey, listen, I wanted to get to your Jared Diamond essay before we run out of time.
Oh, well, yeah, thanks. That was it was in the paper on Christmas Day, big readership day for the Times.
I'm sorry, I told you I didn't read it until you sent me the link because you can't. We don't have the Times delivered here, so I normally go down to the store and buy it. But of course, it wasn't open on Christmas Day.
Yeah, I couldn't find a copy in Santa Fe the next day either, because I don't think there's an airplane that brings in our New York Times from Denver, and it didn't arrive. So I didn't get a paper copy.
So what was the occasion of the essay?
Yeah, this was it was actually back in October, and it took me a while to write the piece, and then it was kind of sitting in the queue for a while. They thought, oh, this will be a good Christmas Day story. Jared Diamond's book Collapse, and his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, and everything I had heard about these books, and mostly Guns, Germs, and Steel, which I was more familiar with, is it was basically celebrated as this antidote to racism.
Yes.
The idea was that white Western culture didn't prevail because of some kind of inherent or genetic superiority, but because of accidents of geography. and also accidents of history. But the thing that really, the Diamond really brought out to the forefront was accidents of geography,
Yes.
and I knew the book had been criticized mostly from the right,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently there were people who stalked his appearances for a while after the book came out. White supremacists.
Really?
And,
Oh, my God.
And so the criticism that I'd heard would all come from the right, and then I was kind of surprised to see, how did this happen? Oh, I know, it was a guy that I know, an archaeologist named John Ware, who used to be in Santa Fe, and I'd written about some of his work on with the Anasazi before the disappearance of the Anasazi, and he's now directing this place called the Amarand Foundation down in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, and they were having a conference about in which these anthropologists and archaeologists and historians were getting together to talk about Jared Diamond, and they were really mad at Diamond, and they thought that Guns, Germs, and Steel, rather, they didn't see it so much as a anti-racist book, but as something that justified the conquerors and justified colonialism. It's basically saying that it was inevitable, and
that is just absurd.
That's what was my first take on it, and the way they put it was excusing the excesses of the conquerors, saying that, and well, the part that struck me though was they were saying that the whole idea plays down the notion of human agency.
Yes.
So it's sort of like people, geographical determinism was the phrase that kept being used, and it plays down the idea that people are motivated by ideologies, and that you can't just say that Europeans conquered these African countries because they had all of the resources, and they had the shape of their continent and the trade winds going this way or that way. That that's all a factor, but it really excuses excuses them for making the decision to conquer, or the decision to do it in a certain way, or to treat their victims in a certain manner, so that it eliminated human agency was their main criticism of that book. And then with Collapse, which again to me, Collapse was pretty much revered as this book, kind of this cautionary tale about how a society can destroy itself for making bad decisions, and by giving these examples of how that's happened throughout history and how it's happening throughout the world today, leaving the implication that we could do this to ourselves with Western society and global warming. So, and again, criticism came from the right, but here they were coming from the left with people saying that, this book was basically blaming the victims for destroying their own culture, like the Eastern Islanders for one, where they cut down all the trees supposedly to help make and move these giant stone heads, and then they drove themselves into extinction.
So, and Guns, Germs, and Steel, critics are faulting Diamond for downplaying human agency and responsibility, right. And in Collapse, they're accusing him of making too much of human agency and responsibility.
Right. That was an interesting contradiction that kept coming up in the conference, because one book plays down human agency and one book plays it up. So their interpretation was that, well, basically, Diamond, from his Western Eurocentric perspective, is excusing the conquerors and then blaming the victims.
Yeah, I thought that was, when I read your essay, I guess the lesson that I took away, reading between the lines, was that these are social scientists who are just sick with envy at the tremendous success of Jared Diamond, who, I'm a real big fan of Diamond's work. I think, he's sort of like Steve Pinker. He's somebody who has the knack for writing in a way that is very scientifically rigorous and yet is gripping for enough for a mass audience.
Yeah.
He has he sort of takes what can be very dry academic scientific material and imposes a dramatic narrative on it, has big themes that, of course, you can quibble with, but that are very provocative, that spur further thinking about, these really important issues, the relative roles of genetics and geography in human history, for example.
No, I agree, and they were, the critics at this conference too, definitely conceded that. They said, this guy really can write, and we write these turgid things that nobody reads except a few of our colleagues, and a big part of the impetus of the conference was how they can get some kind of writing out there, or a book that they could collaborate on that would give an alternate message. And so I really wrote this essay pretty much straight down the middle. I mean, what fascinated me was just this kind of, I just love these intellectual controversies like this, and try to bring up the two sides and then reflect on them. And there's definitely a certain postmodern kind of element to a lot of the criticism.
Postmodern and sort of anti-Western, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. I understand all that. It's just remarkable to me that these critics could see Diamond as somehow pro-Western white imperialist.
I know.
Let me just tell you, there's sort of a coincidence here for me. Over the last few days, I've been reading a really interesting book called by two environmentalists called Breakthrough. I'm holding it up here. These are two guys, Ted Norhaus and Michael Schellenberger, two young environmentalists who wrote an essay called The Death of Environmentalism that came out a few years ago, and it was a stinging critique of conventional methods of environmentalists for basically scaring people into taking action to curb pollution and carbon emissions and so forth. And they have a critique of Diamond in here, of collapse, that I found really interesting and more substantial than the criticisms of some of the people you quote. The problem that they have with collapse is that they say it's too much fear-mongering, and so that Diamond is presenting one society after another that has been destroyed really by its own missteps, and Diamond is saying that we face...
he uses the word ecocide.
Yeah, and so Diamond is saying that we face this situation now globally, and we've got to do something about it. But it's a scary book. I read Collapse a couple of years ago when it came out and reviewed it for Discover, and I remember being pretty alarmed at the end of the book. There's this little sort of half-hearted optimistic coda that Diamond tacks on, but the overall message I thought was pretty scary. And what these two environmentalists say in Breakthrough is that this method of scaring people, which environmentalists have used traditionally, it goes back to Rachel Carson in Silent Spring, where she's saying we're destroying nature with pesticides. It's the problem is that instead of leading to action, it often leads to fatalism and passivity and to selfishness. And these guys even quote something called, they don't use this phrase, they use a different phrase, but it's something called terror management theory. That's this very kind of trendy idea that's come out of social science over the last, it's really become popular since 9/11. The idea is that when people are frightened or reminded of their own mortality and the fragility of life, they cling more tightly to their own core social values, and they become more intolerant of other people's values, and they also tend to reach out to and support authoritarian figures more. And so these guys are saying that the risk of the type of fear-mongering of Diamond and other environmentalists is that it will lead to, instead of the kind of open-minded search for new ideas to get past our ecological crisis, it will lead to clinging to what we've done in the past and to support for sort of authoritarian figures like, let's say, George Bush.
I'll have to read that. That sounds interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'll link to this terror management idea, and
I'd like to read that, and I'll link to my essay because I don't think I explained it very well.
No, I think it's well, as I said, sometimes these best-selling authors, you and I should be in this position of becoming so successful that if critics come up with any cockamamie complaint against your work, I'd love to be in that.
Yeah, I know, it's something to aspire to. Yeah.
So, I think
we've done it again.
So no garage science this year.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to skip that this time just because I wanted to say, when I watched the last week I did the margarita battery. How many batteries does it take to light a light bulb? And I was disappointed when I saw the video and you couldn't really see the light lighting up very well.
I saw it was that little red. It was an LED.
Yeah, a little red thing. Yeah, it wasn't as prominent as I hoped. But one thing, since I did that experiment, I've been thinking more about what's actually going on inside. Basically you have a glass of lemon juice or some kind of acid, and then you have the copper and the zinc electrode. And basically the acid's eating at both of these metal electrodes, but the zinc electrode is more corrosive, so it oxidizes, is the technical term, and it oxidizes faster than the copper. And what oxidation is, it means that the zinc is giving up electrons to the solution, and and that's leaving these charged zinc atoms, and then they're glomming onto oxygen atoms, so you're oxidizing the zinc. But in the meantime, since it's oxidizing faster than the copper, you're getting an excess of electrons on it, so therefore, you have a battery, since you have a potential difference. So that really interested me, and then I was wondering, the reason that this happens in an acid is because an acid is something that, for various reasons, is rich in hydrogen ions. In a hydrogen ion, since an ion is an atom that has an electron or more removed, so it has a charge. And hydrogen just has one, proton surrounded by one electron, so a hydrogen ion is really a proton. So basically you have this, this lemon juice soup of protons. And this oxidation going on. And then at the same time, the voltage that's, set up between the copper and the zinc is breaking the water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen, so it's just amazing how much is going on there. Yeah. So I was just contemplating that while I think of what to do for some future garage band science.
Oh, well, you're good.
I do have some spectacular one that I'm going to do, but it's going to take some more preparation.
All right, well, that's a great way to build anticipation.
Oh, yeah. So New Year's Eve is coming up, so I hope you have a good one.
Yeah, same here. I guess I hope we're off next week, but
I think we should get the week off.
Let somebody else, let Carl get back in here.
Yeah, I think we may be suffering from overexposure here.
Well,
yeah, get Carl on and. And I don't really like New Year's Eve, so I just kind of hide out.
Yeah, I think we're going to stay home and have pizza and watch an old movie or something.
That sounds perfect. Yeah.
All right, man.
Okay, John, it's good talking to you.
I will talk to you soon.
Okay, till the next.